Teenagers were killed on impact. Since that time, reports claim that the girl's ghost has been seen wandering up the roadway and aimlessly strolling the cemetery at the top of the hill. Over the Have you ever seen a ghost? The place known today as Hot Rod Haven is actually a winding and twisting stretch of road called Mitchell Hill Road. Years ago, it used to be a popular spot for teenagers to go and test their racing skills and their cars. That all ended when two teenagers did not come back alive. Back in 1946, a young woman, Sarah Mitchell, and her date Roy Clark were on their way to a dance. As they were coming down the hill, Clark lost control of the car and crashed at the curve. Both teenagers were killed on impact. Since that time, reports claim that the girl's ghost has been seen wandering up the roadway and aimlessly strolling the cemetery at the top of the hill. Over the years, many drivers have seen the apparition on the road at night. Have you ever seen a ghost? The place known today as Hot Rod Haven is actually a winding and twisting stretch of road called Mitchell Hill Road. Years ago, it used to be a popular spot for teenagers to go and test their racing skills and their cars. That all ended when two teenagers did not come back alive. Back in 1946, a young woman, Sarah Mitchell, and her date Roy Clark were on their way to a dance. As they were coming down the hill, Clark lost control of the car and crashed at the curve. Both teenagers were killed on impact. Since that time, reports claim that the girl's ghost has been seen wandering up the roadway and aimlessly strolling the cemetery at the top of the hill. Over the years, many drivers have seen the apparition on the road at night. Never do what she did. A young couple got married and, after the wedding, they held a reception in the bride's grandmother's house. All their family and friends arrived and they laughed, danced, and sang long into the night. After the wedding reception, the guests decided to play a game of hide and seek. The groom covered his eyes and began counting to 100 while his new bride and the other guests ran out of the room, looking for somewhere to hide. Eventually, the groom had found everyone except his beautiful bride. The other guests began calling out her name and searched everywhere for the young woman. They began to grow more and more uneasy when they couldn't find any trace of her. Eventually, they gave up searching and everybody assumed that the girl had run away and left her husband. As the weeks went by, the husband accepted that his beautiful bride must have had second thoughts about their marriage. He decided to forget about her and go on with his life. A few years later, a cleaning lady was dusting in the attic when she came across an old trunk. Out of curiosity, she opened it. Inside the trunk, she found the rotting corpse of a young woman, still dressed in a bridal gown. There was a wedding ring on one bony finger. It was the missing bride. She must have hidden in the trunk and accidentally locked herself inside. It was impossible to tell whether she had suffocated or starved to death, but her face was frozen in a silent scream. There was a 7-year-old girl named Molly who absolutely loved dolls. She collected every doll she could and displayed them on a shelf in her bedroom. She wasn't doing very well in school, so her parents told her that if her grades improved, they would buy her a new doll as a reward. Molly was motivated to try her best and, a few weeks later, her report card arrived from school. She had studied so hard that she managed to get straight A's. Her mother and father were delighted and decided to make good on their promise. The next morning, Molly's mother brought her to the mall so they could go shopping for her gift. As they passed by the window of a second-hand toy store, the little girl grabbed her mother's arm and asked if they could go inside. When they entered the shop, the woman told her daughter she could choose any item she wanted, no matter what price it was. Molly wandered up and down the aisles of the dusty old toy shop until she eventually came to the doll section. On the top shelf, partially obscured by dusty old boxes, was something that immediately caught her eye. It was a clown doll with red hair, yellow eyes, and a big red nose. The clown's wizened face was twisted into a malicious grimace and its teeth were sharp and jagged. One of the clown's gnarled hands was clenched in a fist, but the other was holding up 3 fingers. Molly turned to her mother and squealed, "Mommy, this is the one I want." Are you sure? Asked her mother incredulously. But it's so ugly and creepy. The little girl nodded excitedly. I want it, I want it, I want it. Well, all right then, said her mother as she took the clown doll down from the shelf and brought it over to the counter. The owner of the store took one look at the doll and said, I'm sorry, madam. That clown doll is not for sale. What? Why ever not? Exclaimed the surprised woman. The owner refused to answer. The mother looked down and saw her daughter's eyes welling up with tears. She began arguing with the shopkeeper and offered him more and more money, but he kept refusing. Eventually, she said, I'll pay you $100, and held out the money in front of him. The owner's eyes grew wide. He hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the money greedily and said, Okay, you can have it. He put the clown doll in a bag and gave it to the mother. As Molly and her mother walked out of the shop, the owner called out after them just one thing, he said. Never leave your daughter alone with that doll. The mother and daughter didn't pay any attention to him and left, happy with their purchase. When they got home, Molly immediately rushed into the living room. The girl was overjoyed with her present and spent the rest of the day playing happily with her clown doll while her mother watched television. As the little girl played with the doll, she wondered why it was holding up 3 fingers. Later that night, when Molly went to bed, she placed the doll on the top shelf in her bedroom. Her mother kissed her goodnight and shut the bedroom door. Bright and early the next morning, the mother was cooking breakfast and called out to Molly to wake her up. When she didn't receive an answer after calling her for the 3rd time, the mother began to get worried. She decided to go upstairs and get her daughter out of bed. When she walked into Molly's bedroom, she was horrified to find her daughter lying dead on the floor in a pool of blood. Her throat had been sliced open and her eyes had been poked out. There was a sharp knife embedded in her chest. For a few moments, Molly's mother couldn't believe what she was seeing. But when she looked down and saw the clown doll sitting beside her daughter's mutilated body, she began screaming in horror. The clown doll was holding up 4 fingers.
Lindor, made to melt you by the Lindt Master Chocolatier.
It was past midnight now, and I still had a while until I met my destination. The girl I picked up an hour ago was asleep in the seat beside me. She was a hitchhiker. I couldn't leave a teenager alone at night in the pouring rain. I had to pick her up. She seemed pretty happy that someone was finally giving her a ride. I didn't know her real name, only that her friends call her Jo. She looked so calm, so peaceful. Her brown hair obscured half her gorgeous face, her lips flexed in a barely noticeable smile. She must be having a nice dream. I tried to remember the last dream I had, but had no luck. Then, I felt it, a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. A terrible, ugly feeling. I looked down at the girl as I drove, hoping her smiling face might help me overcome and not give in to the demon within, but I could feel it clawing to get out. I didn't want to. I couldn't. I needed to get the girl out of the car, but that would take too long. It would happen before then. I continued to struggle, fighting an inner battle. Then, no. I couldn't contain it. It happened. I let out the most monstrous fart I'd ever released. It was legendary. It was the kind of thing kids would tell stories about to scare younger kids. I reluctantly looked to see if the beast that escaped my body had woken the girl. It had.
Be careful. Some things are not what they appear to be. There was a boy named Matthew who was 14 years old. It was his father's birthday, and he wanted to buy him something nice. Unfortunately, he didn't have very much money, so he decided to go to a flea market. Browsing through the stalls and car boot sales, he spotted a camera. He remembered that his father had always wanted one, so he picked it up and took a look at it. The camera was a bit old and there were scratches and scuff marks on the outside, but when he looked through the viewfinder, everything was clear. Even though it was second-hand, it seemed in good condition. To see if it worked, he took a picture of a large mirror that was propped up against a nearby table. He asked the seller how much he wanted for it. The price was cheaper than he had expected, so he immediately handed over the cash and bought it. As he was leaving, the seller mentioned that the camera had once belonged to 4 college students who had mysteriously disappeared. When he heard this, Matthew was a little unnerved. All of a sudden, he heard the sound of breaking glass. When he spun around, he saw that the mirror he had taken a picture of had just fallen over and shattered into tiny pieces. That evening, Matthew, his mother, and his little brother waited anxiously for his father to come home from work. As soon as he opened the front door, they shouted happy birthday and started giving him their gifts. The camera was exactly what his father had wanted. He went out to the garden to test out the camera and took a photo of a tree and the family dog. A few hours later, the tree withered and died. The family dog ran out in front of a car and was killed. Saddened by these events, Matthew sat alone in the garden and examined up the camera. He discovered that there were other photos saved in the memory. He found pictures that the 4 students had taken of themselves before their disappearance. That was when it finally dawned on him. The camera was cursed. He had to tell his parents. He dropped the camera on the grass and ran inside the house. "Dad. Dad. The camera is cursed," he cried. "Whatever it takes of a picture of gets destroyed or dies." They raced out to the garden again and Matthew was horrified to see his brother playing with the camera. Quickly, he ran over and snatched it out of the little boy's hands. "Did you take any pictures?" Matthew demanded. "Yes, why?" his brother replied. Matthew's heart sank. "What did you take a picture of?" he asked. "I took a picture of the sun," said his brother. "Cool, right?" Just then, it started to grow very dark.
All new Barbie Cutie reveal! Cutie! I got the bunny! She can move! There's a Barbie under there! Mini pet. I want all these Barbie Cutie! Barbie Cutie reveals all sold separately.
You can beat anything.
There was a teenage girl named Dorothy Bannister who lived with her father in an old mansion called Bannister Hall in the town of Preston in Lancashire, England. Her nickname was Dolly and the local people called her the Bannister Doll. Dolly was a very attractive girl and she got a lot of attention from young men. Most of the boys in the town were chasing after her. One day, Dolly went to her father and nervously told him she had something to confess. She was pregnant. When her father heard this, he flew into a violent rage. Seething with anger, he dragged the teenage girl out to the garden and chained her to a stone. Then, he whipped her to death for embarrassing her family. Years later, the stone where Dolly had been so brutally murdered was still standing and mothers would take their young daughters to see it as a warning of what could happen if they got pregnant. None of the girls in town wanted to end up like the Bannister doll. Dolly's body was buried in the grounds of the Holy Trinity Church at Preston, but the story doesn't end there. Not long after the Bannister doll's death, the corpse of a young man was found lying in the center of Preston. His skull had been smashed to smithereens and his ribcage had been beaten to a pulp. The authorities were mystified as to how he'd met his end. 2 weeks later, the dead body of a second young man was discovered in similar circumstances. When a third young man was found dead, rumors began to spread around the town like wildfire. They said that the ghost of Dolly Bannister had returned from the grave to wreak vengeance on all young men for the way her father had so cruelly murdered her. Some people claimed that they had seen the ghost of a young girl in chains floating up Snow Hill at dusk. The sight of her terrified anyone who caught a glimpse of her. It was said that if you heard the chains rattling of a dark night, your days were numbered. After Dolly's father died, a new family moved into the house, but they didn't stay long. The ghost of the Bannister doll appeared to them and harassed them for 2 nights before they left the house, never to return. Another family moved in, but they only managed to stick it out for 3 nights before they fled in terror. Bannister doll is still occasionally seen in Preston, and those who have seen her report feeling an aura of tremendous fear and chilling malevolence, a stark contrast to the shy and mild young woman she was in life. Years ago, in a small town, somewhere in the United States, a married couple and their young daughter moved into an old house. One night, the daughter was awakened by a strange smell in her bedroom. At first, she wasn't sure if she was still dreaming. She could hardly breathe and the air was thick with smoke. As she blinked her eyes and looked around, she found that her bedroom looked different. The wallpaper was old and peeling off the walls. The carpet was threadbare and worn away in places. The furniture in her room seemed to be old-fashioned and there were cobwebs and mold all over everything. Frightened, she jumped out of bed and tried to make